Hi everyone, my name is Beata Wilczek and this is Fashion Knowledge, a podcast educating, disrupting, and shaping fashion futures. Fashion Knowledge is brought to you by Unfolding Strategies, a consultancy and education lab for digital, inclusive, and sustainable fashion in Web3. Hi, welcome everyone. In this episode of Fashion Knowledge, we have an amazing guest, Kimberly Jenkins. I'm very excited about these conversations because Kim's work has been big personal inspiration for me, both in terms of its content and subject matter, but also in a way of forms of delivery, because Kim has been exploring with different ways on how to talk about very important topics in fashion, how to transform it and change it, but also has been experimenting when thinking, how can we build platforms and different ways of communication and take it not only from academic context, but also bring it to the industry. So I'm very, very excited to have you here with us today. And I would love you to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for the work that you do in the fashion system for many years and for inviting me to be part of your podcast. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you and your community today. So in terms of, I guess, how I label myself these days is a fashion studies scholar and just trying to lead the way in fashion education, fashion pedagogy. I am the founder of a platform, a learning platform that I created called the Fashion and Race Database. I also founded a consultancy, Artis Solomon Consulting, and I have been a professor in the field of fashion studies for over 10 years, teaching from my alma mater, Parsons School of Design, where I got my master's degree in fashion studies. I taught there for about nearly 7 years. And then I also, concurrently, I taught at Pratt Institute for a little over 6 years. And then I went on to move to Canada from New York to teach at Toronto Metropolitan University, which was formerly Ryerson University. And now I ended up leaving teaching, stepping away from teaching formally in an institution to focus full-time on the Fashion and Race Database, which I've been doing now, again, as my full focus for the past 2 years. But that could always change. That could pivot this year. So I'm always exploring new pathways with where my work is taking me. But that's a little bit about me.
Great. And this is so maybe before we start talking about Fashion and Race Database and Artis Solomon and looking into some examples of the work that you do, maybe we can take a little step back and you can share a bit about your background, about your journey, what happened before all of this and what led you to it.
I think like many of us in the field of fashion studies, we were maybe as children or as teenagers, we had this inclination towards creativity, the arts, fashion. I know for myself, as a teenager, I loved fashion with a capital F, watched fashion television and with Jeannie Becker and CNN Style with Elsa Clench and House of Style on MTV, anything that was fashion, I was just a sponge absorbing it, memorizing all of the supermodels' names and their personalities, all the fashion designers, and wearing all the labels that I could possibly afford as a teenager. But then in my late teens, I found myself interested in cultural studies, religious studies, just all the textiles, just all these other fields of study that I thought was in conflict at that time with fashion. I was sort of grappling with the fact that I was liking something that was so superficial, perhaps, and something that was also stigmatized as frivolous and trend-based, fleeting. And how could I reconcile that with my interest in sociology, anthropology? And so, long story short, I ended up majoring in cultural anthropology and minoring in art history with a focus on non-Western art history. And I found myself towards the end of my undergraduate studies in anthropology and art history. I was writing all these papers about costume, dress, fashioning, bodies, and this is in the very early 2000s. And I didn't know that essentially as an undergrad student, this is in Texas where I was growing up at the university, that I was essentially writing fashion studies papers. And I had a wonderful art history professor who was actually a visiting assistant professor, so she wasn't even tenured or full-time there. And she saw something in me and would take me into her office. We'd sit down at her computer, and she had encouraged me to go into, get a master's degree, go into graduate school. And I was describing to her fashion studies, really, but I didn't know it existed yet. And so we were just looking at different programs, and this is around 2007 or so. And there just wasn't anything that we could immediately find. There was I was sort of led to it. There's some books that I would find in the school library by like Daniel Miller, material culture, things like that. All of this scholarship coming out of the UK. Sophie Woodward, Lou Taylor, Hazel Clark. And so I would see those names and I'm just thinking to what is this? What is, it's not fashion history. It's not fashion design. What is it? And so I ended up discovering a brand new program out of Parsons called Fashion Studies that seemed to be at the intersection of fashion anthropology, sociology, economics, religion, gender, race, all of those aspects. And I was so excited about it. And I applied and got in, and I was in their second cohort. So I guess you could say we were sort of guinea pigs because it was a newish program. They had just welcomed their first cohort. And so I joined in 2011. And my inspiration at that point in applying for a master's program was to become a fashion curator. Because by the time I had graduated with my undergrad degree, I thought, okay, well, it looks like the only careers out there with this sort of intellectual approach to fashion is being a fashion curator. So I decided to go get a master's degree in hopes of becoming a fashion curator or something like that. But as I journeyed through the 2-year program, I discovered that there's other pathways, like being a fashion professor, teaching fashion history and theory. You can go, of course, into fashion publishing, writing for a magazine, but I wasn't particularly interested in writing for magazines, though I did a little bit of that during my time in the program. But that's what I ended up doing. After I graduated, I ended up becoming a professor teaching. And it was such a new program and such a nascent field that it was not to say that there weren't any standards or anything, but it was just easier to go into teaching fashion studies because they really needed people to sort of, for lack of a better word, evangelize this field. They needed people to show what you could do with that. They needed people to teach some of these classes to undergraduate students. So I started right away after graduating, teaching at Parsons School of Design and at Pratt Institute for the next almost 7 years. And those are just really the best years of my life. It was a struggle as I navigated, a joyful struggle. As I navigated academia, I discovered how precarious it is for myself, along with others, my other colleagues. For better or for worse, we were just so excited to be in a field, this new exciting field, and just so excited to stay there and teach. But at the same time, we were starting to experience what happens inside of many of these institutions where they are taking on part-time laborers, part-time intellectuals, and, you're not getting paid much. You're working as an adjunct professor. You're just trying to make ends meet, but you're just so passionate about the field. You don't feel great about it. at least for here in the US, health insurance was difficult to come by. So you're in this field where you're excited and you're teaching because they need you to teach, but at the same time, you're not fully being taken care of in that way, just due to the logistics of our employment systems here. So I endured that for almost 7 years before getting an offer to move to Canada for a full-time tenure track professor position, which was a tremendous relief. And so then I went on to teach fashion studies there. I was a fashion studies professor there.
I have a question before we dive deep into your work. First of all, it's very interesting what you said about discovering fashion studies. My experience was a bit different. I think I was doing almost the same, but I was studying social psychology, and I really wanted to write my master's about fashion, but I was not allowed to. My professor said that this is not a good topic, that you shouldn't do that. And I remember buying a book. I went to London maybe for the first time in my life, and at Tate Modern, they used to have an amazing book selection. I think now they don't anymore. But there was a book about fashion theory, like a big reader from Routledge. And I remember being so excited about it. And I think it's 2006, 2007, and bringing it back. And in the end, they didn't let me. And it's so ridiculous because, the discipline that I am coming from is about predicting group behavior, human motivation. So fashion should be just like a staple, research topic. But somehow it wasn't possible. So I wish I would have that professor that would encourage that and be aware of that. Because in the end, my master thesis was about, authoritarian personality and aesthetical kind of art preferences. So it was very, very different. So it's interesting to hear your journey, but it's about similar time. And I would probably have many questions about fashion studies as a discipline, but maybe we can keep it for another time. You're, I would say, recognized very much because of Fashion and Race database, which you established in 2017. It's an online platform that challenges traditional narratives and misrepresentation in fashion history. So I'm curious to know what inspired you to create it, because I know it's also a lot of work and it's a lot of ongoing work. And who is it for? Who benefits from it? Why is it important?
I'm one of those people who I love structure, but also I get excited by things sometimes that are not as structured. So in the fashion studies program, it was this newish field of study and a newish program. And so it both provided frameworks. They offered us frameworks for thinking through and about fashion. But it also left enough room to play with ideas, challenge things, add to the conversation or discourse about fashion. And so at that particular school, Parsons School of Design, they also had this very nice kind of democratic process of being able to pitch an elective. They allowed part-time lecturers to pitch an elective course. And if it was accepted, you get to run it for a semester, maybe two. So I was a couple of years out of graduation by that point. I graduated in 2013. And about maybe 2015, I decided to pitch a course, a syllabus called Fashion and Race. And to be honest with you, at first when I was speaking with one of my professors, she thought I should change the name. Maybe Fashion and Race is a little too direct, a little too harsh, I'm not sure if a course like that will be accepted. But I wrote the syllabus anyway and kept the name because I wanted it to be very clear so that students can identify it, and what you see is what you get. This is a class quite literally about fashion and race. And it was not accepted the first time around. And what was interesting is 2015, it was not accepted. But then the following year, it was in 2016. And that was coming off the back of some fresh protests that were happening in the United States, where young Black men were getting shot by the police at an alarming rate. So suddenly there was this kind of shift, and I'm fairly certain they thought, well, this is a class that's needed now. So the course went live. It was waitlisted, and which shows just how needed it was for students. And usually it's supposed to run for maybe one semester, and it ended up running for 3 years, really until I left. The reason I stopped the course is because I got the job in Canada a few years later. So it was a class that was very, very special, because I learned it really provided a forum for design students. And it wasn't just fashion design students, photography students, graphic design students were all enrolling in this course. And so how do we get to the Fashion Race database? As I was developing the syllabus for that course, I went back home to Texas. It was kind of sentimental. I went back home to Texas the summer before I led the course. And I went back to the university where it all started, where I went and got my undergraduate degree. And I got a guest pass to the library. And I really wanted to spend the summer thinking through, what would a fashion and race course look like? So I'm going back through all those books that I was combing through years before, where I was first discovering fashion studies books. And I actually sat there and cobbled together a fashion and race syllabus. And I say cobbled together because it truly took not just going in the stacks where fashion books are. I had to go into ethnic and cultural studies books. I had to go into art history books, gender studies books. And I started just writing down all these ideas from the tables of contents from all of these books from disparate disciplines and fields, and connecting the dots. And connecting the dots for anyone who was rolling their eyes and thinking, okay, what on earth does race have to do with fashion? How are you going to make that work? And so I just started studying the way race and the impact and implications of race was impacting art history or gender studies and all these other fields. And so as I start finding all these books, I kind of had this light bulb moment of, well, if anyone else is thinking the way I am, maybe I should start documenting all of these books I'm finding that is useful in studying this. So I purchase a website, one of those out-of-the-box websites that you can get, and I called it the Fashion and Race Database Project. And again, this is around 2016. And it really kind of takes off by 2017. So I start listing books, articles, films, filmed panel discussions, filmed lectures, all kinds of things on the website. And then I start getting emails from people around the world saying, this helped me for my dissertation. I just discovered your website. And that's when I knew I was onto something. If this is helpful for me, it's helpful for many other people. So fast forward to 2020. I land in Canada now after teaching the fashion and race course at Parsons School of Design for about 3 years. I land in Canada, and by this point, people know about the fashion and race course and its success. People know about this fashion and race database website that I had at the time. And also people had known that I had been tapped by Gucci to help them through cultural sensitivity and awareness with design decisions that they were making. And so once I landed in Canada, I had the privilege of getting some research funding to be able to expand the Fashion and Race Database, which now is just called the Fashion and Race Database, no longer the project. And so I was able to hire on students, start getting research students, because I wanted to broaden the discourse around fashion and race. And I didn't want it to just be from my perspective or my point of view. So I would invite people to write for it and hire research assistants from different lived experiences and cultural and ethnic backgrounds to write about things that matter to them, so that we can have a nice broad perspective for the reader. And after a couple of years, I had actually left Canada and decided to just resign from being a professor there and just go full time into seeing what would happen if I poured all of my energy into this fashion race database, because people need it. So I take a risk, leave teaching, and decide to just go full on into the fashion race database. And in 2022, we decided to make it a subscription-based paywall platform, which I had not done in all the years before that. This project needed to survive. This platform needed to survive. It was necessary. It was needed. And so subscription was the way to go. So I was treating it like Bloomsbury, formerly burned Fashion Library. Like it's like Bloomsbury Fashion Central. It's like JSTOR, like ProQuest. Treat it like that. So next thing you know, the summer of 2022, it's just university after university reaching out saying, how can we subscribe? And to this day, now at the time of our you and I's conversation, we've got over 50 universities, colleges, and museums around the world subscribe to it. So it lives in all of their libraries where they are sponsoring access to the Fashion Race database for their students, staff, and faculty, and for curators. And we're global. I mean, we're in Canada, we are in Germany, we are across the UK, in Australia, Paris, and of course, all across the US. There's some other regions in the future that I hope to go into. But it's just really exciting now. Our team is growing. We've got interns this year joining us from universities. We've got just amazing researchers like Dr. Laura Beltran-Rubio, who is now at De Montfort University, teaching about decolonizing design. And Aaliyah Lopez is our assistant researcher, who was a former graduate student of mine in Canada. So it's truly a family affair, because Laura also graduated from the MA Fashion Studies program at Parsons. So we're just really creating a new blueprint for this. And so when it comes to how it's useful, the Fashion Race database, it is now a robust website that lists a whole library or catalog of books, articles, podcasts, exhibitions, recorded panel discussions when it comes to fashion and race. We have original articles. We have some columns that are our signature columns, like Objects That Matter. That's one of my favorite columns or sections of the database. Objects That Matter is something I created several years ago, where we take an object that you know and you're familiar with. So say like a pair of moccasins, a do-rag, cantha cloth. We just have countless pieces on there. Kimono, amongst many others. And so what we do is we use it as a teaching object, where we first situate it with the culture that created it, constructed it, what the materials are for it, how it's supposed to be worn or used, and with, again, contextual images for it. And then after we describe it to you, sort of like a textbook, we have a section inside of that profile of the object called Appropriation and Influence. And we give you usually like 4 examples, 3 to 5 examples of how that object has been influential, for better or for worse. So it's sort of like a do's and don'ts of, here's an example of how a kimono has been worn as homage and appropriately by this fashion designer. And here's an example of how it's been worn maybe by this celebrity inappropriately or misappropriately. So that's one of our most popular sections. We have essays, we have profiles about people. Another favorite section we have is in the news. And we comb all the news headlines for all the headlines that are related to fashion and race, like diversity, colonialism, labor and sustainability issues, celebrations of representation in fashion, when it comes to the hiring of new designers or models. And so we list that every 2 weeks. And added to that, we contextualize it by adding further readings. So we not only just give you the headlines that you can find yourself, but we also give you suggestions for further reading so that you better understand why this headline matters and, what's the historical background of it. So and we've also launched learning guides. We have learning guides, like a little ebook on a certain subject matter. now each month, and programming, virtual programming. So we have talks and conversations where we bring people in who are all part of this great discourse on fashion and race. So it's there's never a dull moment. It keeps me busy every single day, along with everyone else.
It's a very rich offer. In the beginning, you said that, this idea to introduce subscription model and paywall, you referred to like very academic examples. And what I particularly like about Fashion and Race Database is how accessible it is, how visual it is, how somehow it's very approachable. So I think this is something that I really like. And I was always wondering, can it become like an institute? Can it become like a place that also has a building, not only virtually, that's as a space that facilitates conversation? Or maybe it becomes also a printed matter, so printed publication. I always had those thoughts, how it could evolve, how it could be other formats. But I've always been very interested how you use probably to the maximum the potential in different formats that are associated with platforms, with online journalism, with creating content across different also social media platforms to promote it. So yeah, that was very interesting. But have you ever thought about taking it outside from the screen and bringing it somewhere else?
That would be ideal. Sort of like Elise Olsen. I'm on the board of directors for the oh gosh, I'm so embarrassed. I'm forgetting. I think it's the International Fashion Research. It's
Library.
Yes, the Fashion Library, where she was really lucked out in getting this amazing space to collect all this fashion ephemera. And so it's like a physical library you can go to. And it's just wonderful. And I would love something like that where we could actually have a proper space to house all of these books, where it's no longer just this digital catalog library, virtual library. Because right now, all we can do inside the database is just lead you to the publisher's link or lead you to where you can find it inside your respective library. But it'd be so nice to have the funding or sponsorship to have a physical space that is not just a library, but it's a space for us to host our events, maybe host a podcast, get on your level and host a podcast too, and especially have research rooms, spaces where people can work. There's just, I guess I have the good problem of we have so many people who want to work at the Fashion Rings database, and I want to give space to all of these people, because I regret that there's just all these amazing scholars approaching us wanting to write for us, but I just don't have the capacity. We don't have enough staff to help support them. I want to make sure that they're supported and paid, and we just don't have that yet. We're doing okay, but we're just not. It would just be so nice to have that.
There's definitely opportunities to grow and scale it up and to expand. But I remember that also you used to make, for example, podcasts in partnership with brands, and I was curious. So because so far we're very much attached to academic context and research in a kind of traditional way, but for those who don't know your work sits in between, not only in academia, and this is the part that I'm very interested in, because I really firmly believe that there's so many important, relevant, pretty much necessary topics discussed in fashion studies, but it's such a little discipline that not many people know about, and I think that fashion industry simply can and should benefit from it, and this is what you also actively do. So maybe we can talk a little bit. I don't know if somebody who's listening who works for a brand, how they can work with you, what are different ways, or what are examples of different brands working with you, either with Fashion Race Database or Artis Solomon.
Oh gosh, what you bring up can be so divisive in our field, as you probably know. There's so many opinions about that. For anyone listening, and and perhaps for the uninitiated, there's these kind of camps or schools of thought. There's the purists who want intellectual conversations to stay amongst academics, and it's frowned upon among some to want to create this bridge to, say, industry and, ultimately capitalism. I get it. Or to the public realm, to the pedestrian audience, because it dilutes or compromises the integrity of the academic work we're doing. So there's that. And then there's some of us who are very much interested in creating these bridges, because we know that there's so many rich discussions that we're having inside academia that we know can serve the public, can create a more intelligent fashion system, that we know can lead to better choices in the fashion industry, that can just create better practices in the industry. So I have to admit, first of all, in answering your question, it took some soul searching and time to just embrace that is the kind of person I am. I'm the bridge builder. I'm interested in that because I'd be lying if I told you that I hadn't, had a finger wagged in my face of, I don't like that you're doing that, or why are I don't like that you're making things accessible to the public, or I don't like that you're working with industry. And not just academic purists in some ways, but activists also who get concerned that something can be compromised because the industry is the enemy. And so it's still something I grapple with and wrestle with, because the industry is going to remain. And that's just a matter of fact. And as long as the industry remains and is having an impact on our everyday lives and our consumption decisions every single day, I want to at least be in the conversations, guiding them and talking to them. And that's just my point of view. And I know it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. But one example of collaboration that I did beyond Gucci that you're kind of speaking to is I created a podcast with Tommy Hilfiger. It was our first ever podcast. I helped conceptualize it, co-produced it, and hosted it. And I have to say, yes, it is a major fashion brand. It's part of a conglomerate. But I was very impressed with the fact that they had such a high respect for me as an academic and as a historian, and that they wanted to be part of the solution, and they thought that it would be innovative as a fashion brand to engage academics, to create something that's creative, engaging in terms of creating conversations of what is, what's more engaging than podcasts right now with reaching people. And so we decided to create a podcast called The Invisible Seam that was about the sometimes hidden or underrepresented contributions of Black culture to American fashion. And so it was really kind of this dream collaboration, because here you've got the fashion studies academic coming in who knows how to frame conversations from a historical perspective, from a theoretical perspective, who has connections to scholars that we can bring in as guests. Oh, I know a curator. Let's call this person also. Here's some emerging designers we can bring into the conversation, costume designers. And then they are the brand that's all about American sportswear. And so they have the big name where they can get people listening and help influence the conversation and, bring these fashion studies, legitimize, I guess if you want to say that, these conversations for a larger audience. And so it was wonderful to be able to have their power and influence step back. This is the biggest thing for me. Step back and let us work. Let us do this educational podcast. Let me host it. They entrusted me when I say we need to get scholars like Elizabeth Way and Monica Miller into the conversation. They trusted me to do that. In addition to having the Fashion Race database, which you can see as a platform where everyone can sort of access it for learning about Fashion Race, I also created Artis Solomon Consulting, where I can work one-on-one with fashion brands, whether it's coming in to speak to their organization and offer lessons from fashion studies as it pertains to some of their pain points or issues. I actually presented on the website in 3 pillars to help fashion brands better understand. So I can help with historical context as one pillar. I can help with putting out fires as a second one, or actually I call it preventative, not putting out the fire, preventative research. So if you want to bring me in or any scholars from my team to come in and say, review a design that you're thinking about, that you're not sure how, you want to make sure it's culturally sensitive, we can do that. And then the third and final pillar is sort of like fashion theory or trend forecasting, and it's the why, the science behind it. So very similar to what you do with your work. So I would say, though, the Fashion Race database is our biggest and most impactful platform, and I don't get as much work or attention with Artis Solomon Consulting, because still this is a very new concept for many fashion brands, and they're just really not sure how to engage with a fashion studies scholar about these things. They're not even sure what some of the problems are.
Could you provide like an example or how you would imagine this relationship working? Because I think sometimes there is a question mark hanging in the air, but people don't know how to approach it and what they would benefit from that. So what would you say fashion brands could benefit from that in simple words? Because this is also the logic of, profit, growth, and benefit. That kind of navigates them.
So preventative research specifically would be helpful for a brand thinking through design decisions, having someone to kind of proofread it, if you will, and look over it and make sure that it's culturally aware sensitive, or they want to go into a new market, or they're inspired by a culture that is outside of their culture and their own market. And so they could enlist us to help them to make sure that they are asking the right questions, they're engaging in an appropriate way, the ways that they want to exchange ideas, or even economically how they engage or interact with with a group of people. You want to make sure that that's done in a culturally aware and sensitive way. You're not coming in and exploiting them. So that's one thing. One thing, though, that there's 2 things happening, though, with this work that I do, unfortunately. And it's that there's companies and brands that don't know what to do with me, even though I try to spell it out on my website. Here's 3 ways that I can engage with you. Here's examples of work I've already done. Here's what, I just really list everything and all the problems that they could possibly have. I list all of it, of how we can help you. So some still just, are kind of cautious and don't know if that's something that they have a budget for or that they want to use. Is this really going to be helpful? So they're still not fully sold or convinced that this is worth spending money on. And then there's the other side, which is they do know and they just don't care. And I know that for sure, because I worked with an organization. I'm not even going to say what kind, because you could then quickly figure it out. But I consulted one organization when it comes to beauty standards and the work that they do in the beauty industry. And the CEO of the organization really liked what I was doing. She was retaining me to help with her team. She understood. She got it. She understood why this is important and what education could do. But she told me, as soon as she reached out to fellow CEOs in this beauty world, one of them actually said to her, when the CEO who was working with me, she invited these other CEOs to come join, saying, look, you've got to come over here. We're learning some really good stuff here. That CEO said, no one is going to listen to that. Nobody cares. Nobody wants to be educated on this. Nothing is going to change in our industry. So there's that. also. The people who are just still pushing forward with the problems and saying nothing will ever change. No, thank you. I'm not interested. So there's that.
Yeah, I think this is a change paradox that's present in beauty, luxury, fashion. On the one hand, that's chasing the trend and whatever is transforming very much in the world of aesthetics, and then on the other hand, being very very resistant to other change that's more connected to, I don't know, social change or cultural conversation, than more like a macro, broader perspective.
Can I add something? With what you just said inspired me to say add this as well. You're very right, because I think you and I both know what happens also, why some people resist this, whether it's also an institution, whether it's institutions or it's corporations. We are in the midst of a great deal of change right now on various levels in society, with environment, labor, gender. I mean, just so much is all happening all at once, all of these pushes for change and liberation and freedom, and walking away from old institutions, old ways of thinking, old ways of doing things. And what happens is, I think also people don't, and not everyone, but we're going to find that many people don't want help or support or education or change, because then they have to take that look in the mirror and see where they've enabled things, where they've been complicit with things. They've upheld some of these very problems that have held others down. It may even necessitate them losing their job, or things being found out about them. So it's really better that you keep the educators away, you keep the change makers away. You don't want to change, you don't want to evolve, or maybe you're going to have to learn something new and unlearn something, change the way that you are doing things. And people are very resistant to that. That's a lot of work. And it can involve some shame. And so you don't want to bring in that change.
So it touches also on the very kind of, I would say, the personal level. So so that's quite interesting. I also, because you know that in my work, I'm very interested in emerging technologies and, for example, how fashion creative industries are swallowing and integrating them. And I was, as you mentioned, also beauty industry. I find it very interesting what we can see now. There's a lot of digital twins, avatars. There's a lot of different kind of, I don't know, I would say online body design that's going on. Do you have any thoughts or observations on that? Was it in any way interesting to you lately, or you noticed something?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm a big tech person. I love technology. I embrace new technologies. I'm never afraid of it. But as I've paid attention, though, to the discourse when it pertains to certain aspects of fashion, like fashion and race, one concern has been, at least particularly with models and labor, the fact that we're having some digital or AI models being created to stand in the place of people of color, models of color who want to work, human models who want to work. Now they are getting pushed out of jobs because we have people just creating models of color. And so there's a couple of things happening with that that's troubling. You are now getting in the way of creating jobs for human models. You are also creating these digital bodies that you can do anything to, labor them infinitely, however you see fit. And you can also construct them to satisfy some aesthetic fantasies that may not be even realistic. Just being able to make them the perfect skin tone, the perfect hair texture, the perfect nose shape, the perfect mouth, all of those things, the perfect waistline. And then the more realistic you have it, now you're pushing them out in front of this audience, and an audience may not even be able to tell if they're real or not for some of them. And now you have particularly young women shaming themselves and feeling, well, I don't look like that. Well, that's not even a real person. So there's that. And I think one interesting thing my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Jonathan Michael Square, has written about and spoken about was Shudu, who was an early digital model, black model. She was constructed to be a black model. And his issue with it, because his scholarship deals with 19th century like enslavement history and fights for liberation. And so from a point of slavery, he found it really interesting that Shudu was created actually by a white man. And so you have this white man who's created this kind of perfect black model, and he's profiting off of her body. And so, so it's just very interesting that he's laboring her body, he's created her, he owns her.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So basically, who are your parents in the virtual realm, and who benefits from that? That's another question. I wanted to ask you one last thing to kind of wrap up our conversation. Behind you, there's a lot of interesting books. So to our listeners, our community, if there's any book that you would recommend that's related to what we talked about today, what would it be?
Well, for anyone listening to this, you may not see my bookshelf behind me, but okay, for race, I know this is going to sound more pedestrian, but it really is an excellent book, and it's Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. There is a reason why a movie has been made about it. I just watched it, called Origin. There's a reason why Isabel Wilkerson has won countless awards for this book. So if for anyone who's interested in understanding race, particularly caste, this is a great book because it adds nuance. Isabel Wilkerson actually distances herself from using the word race with the issues that we're dealing with globally, and she prefers to situate it under the word for the phenomenon of caste. So it's really a great book, again, for anyone who is adamantly just not wanting to have these conversations anymore and wants to believe that race doesn't exist, colonialism, all these different aspects don't exist. This book will challenge that. I also recommend the book Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings, which historicizes fat phobia from a racial perspective. And so she, again, historicizes it and takes you back through art history and how all the politics and the moral shaming that drives fat phobia and what it has to do with race. I think it's excellent. Also, I have so many fashion theory books. I mean, it just really, you can't lose with any of the fashion theory books. I particularly love, as someone from an anthropology background, if I were to name one scholar and her work, it's Sophie Woodward. And so like women in clothes, just women, the wardrobe ethnographies, that was probably one of the most influential methodologies to shape my thinking in fashion studies for over a decade. So again, Sophie Woodward's work on wardrobe ethnographies. And so just adding the substance, speaking to what you were saying earlier, Beata, of just how our professors would sometimes just think, you do not need to waste your time studying fashion. All of these books that are behind me on my bookshelf about fashion theory will challenge that and add substance. And especially Sophie Woodward's work when it comes to the stories that our wardrobes tell, how it is a living, breathing archive in our own home. So those are just some books I recommend just off the top. Because I'm just a big fashion studies nerd.
I think there are so many great books about fashion, and they're not necessarily known. And usually there will be just, I don't know, in the bookstore section or in a museum, there will be, the life and work of Coco Chanel and so on. And I think there's so many of them. So it's always great to hear some people's personal recommendations. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
If you like this podcast and you would like to see it to continue, as well as receive more information from Unfolding Strategies, please visit unfoldingsstrategies.substack.com and subscribe, where you will get access to our recent insights, reading lists, and podcast episodes, as well as archive of past newsletters, talks, and episodes. Thank you for listening.